welcome everyone to this presentation of the myth and lore, science and art of identifying nonconformities. I'm Mike Richmond, your host for Exemplar Global's online auditing expo. This session is presented by Bob Clifford, and Bob is an Exemplar Global certified lead auditor who has recently retired from a 40-year career in compliance and management auditing. That background includes 25 years with a major international accredited certification body conducting quality, safety, environmental, and energy management audits, as well as developing and delivering lead auditor training. In this presentation, as you can see, Bob's going to offer an enlightening and engaging view of nonconformities drawn from his experience and expertise. So Bob Clifford, thanks for joining us here at the Expo.
Well, thank you, Mike. A pleasure to be here.
Of course. Well, get right to it. We're interested in hearing it.
Okay, well, great. Well, thanks very much, Mike, and good day, everybody. Auditing is hard work. It's challenging. None so much as identifying nonconformity. One of the things that practicing auditors need to know is how to make the right call. And in all of my years as a management systems auditor and a compliance auditor, that was always the biggest challenge for me. So the title of this discussion or presentation here is The Science and Art and the Myth and Lore of Identifying Nonconformity. I've switched it up a little bit from the title of the presentation since I thought it's best to talk about the how-to first, and then we can talk about the how-not later on. The importance of this discussion and the importance of identifying nonconformity is that it's relevant to the whole audit process that you conduct as practicing auditors, and that have probably been the topics of other presentations like this. As we'll discuss, it really all culminates in the findings, conformity or nonconformity. So the way we're going to go about talking about identifying nonconformity, and our objective here is to make sure that we understand the terms of art, the practice, the mechanics of recognizing, identifying, and communicating nonconformities to the auditee, or if you're a professional auditor, the client, the customer. And the way I'm going to do that over the next 30 minutes or so is tell you some stories, tell you about what happened to me in the years that I spent, 25 years since becoming a certified auditor with Exemplar, working with a global certification body, conducting management system audits for environment, quality, occupational health and safety, and energy. And so my first story, again, that actually happened to me. This was the first day of a surveillance audit, a 2-day surveillance audit. So the company had management system was certified prior, and the quality manager and I, it was lunchtime, so he invited me into the company cafeteria to grab some lunch. And there we met the plant manager, and she kindly asked us to sit down and have a bite to eat. And so we're sitting there at lunch with the plant manager, and she asked me, how's the audit going? I said, I was going perfectly fine. You know, it's early days here. We just started, but we're right on schedule. And then she asked me that question that if any of you have been here before and done this, you're probably well aware of. She asked that question that any executive wants to know, which is, how many findings? Do we have any findings? She said. And so I looked at her and I said, as deadpan as I could, yeah, we do, about a dozen. And you get that moment where, of course, with any plant manager, their face drains of color, their mouth begins to fall open in surprise. And then suddenly, because this was a surveillance, so I had conducted audits with her before, she smiled a little bit. She suddenly recognized what I was doing. It was all part of the training, so to speak. And so I smiled back at her and I said, and they're all conformities. They're all good. One of the challenges when you get that question as an auditor is, of course, understanding that the executives are focused in on the exceptions, the nonconformities, the findings. But what they're reflecting on is simply the way many people regard audits as a whole. As an exceptions or a negative finding exercise. We're looking for faults, we're looking for aberrations. And that's quite natural because for many audits, the traditional type of adversarial audit that people undergo, government audits, OSHA audits, IRS audits, that's the goal. The goal is to find where the accounting hasn't added up, where there are breaches of regulation. That's just their nature. They're built that way. Uh, Sometimes, though, the audits that we do, particularly conformance audits, management system audits, they're a bit different. And I might want to mention that while I'll be telling the stories mostly from my career as a management systems auditor, looking at conformance of a company to an ISO management system standard, a number of these things about nonconformities can relate to second party supplier audits or even first party internal audits. In auditing, though, words matter. And the key word that the plant manager was asking me about were findings. So let's talk a bit about the definition and then the definitions of the definition that go into the concept of finding and what people sometimes conflate with simply the negatives, with nonconformities. This is from ISO 1911, which is the international standard for management system auditing, with a number of terms and definitions, of course, adopted for or certainly relevant to other types of audits. And the key thing in the definition, even though I have to go down to note one for it, is that audit findings indicate one of two things, conformity or non-conformity. So that's what findings are. They're either or. Now, we all know that there's a third road to take, what we call the audit trail, which is where at a particular part of our audit, we've collected evidence, but can't make a determination of conformity or nonconformity. And so we follow an audit trail that will help us develop additional evidence to make that determination. But at the end of the day, and at any part of our audit, it is either conformity or non-conformity that we need to find. And so that was the play on words that I was having with the plant manager there by reminding her that findings can well be conformity. And halfway through her audit, she had nearly a dozen. If we look at the definition of those two results of an audit, conformity, nonconformity, you can see that the standard defines it as fulfillment of a requirement or non-fulfillment of a requirement. And along with that, secondarily perhaps, a requirement is a need or expectation. In the way the standard writers write all of the ISO standards, very broadly defined. So a need or expectation, and then look at that definition of requirement. It could be something that's implied, an implication could be a requirement. So very broadly defined. And of course, fulfillment. Fulfillment to what degree or extent? Fulfillment to whose satisfaction? Depending on the type of your audit you're in, how you define or how it is defined in the course of your audit, these definitions of the definition, all of those broaden and add to the complexity and challenge of identifying conformity or nonconformity. And so getting back to the first thing I said, auditing is really hard work. It's difficult, it's challenging by design, I guess, in terms of the broadness of these definitions. So my second story, keep that first one in mind. Again, this is the closing meeting of a management system audit. We've got the plant manager and some of the top line managers around the table. The environmental manager is there. And before I begin the closing meeting, he's seen the report. He's been briefed on the number and type of audit findings prior. He asked the plant manager, just for fun, hey, I've got the report, but before we begin, tell me, how many nonconformities would you be comfortable with? The plant manager says, well, I mean, what do you mean? I mean, well, and the quality manager, the environmental manager was trying to just understand, what's your threshold for pain? Maybe what's the point where you're going to get pretty upset with the way things are going? How many nonconformities would you be satisfied with? And this plant manager said something that really struck me, a very evolved statement. He said, well, I'd be happy with all of them. Difficult, aspirative thing to say, as you can imagine, because how do you know how many nonconformities you have unless it's through the process of an audit? But aspiratively as well, he was describing kind of the perfect thing that you want to achieve in an audit, which is he doesn't care about the number as long as he understands what all of them are. In the words of that great philosopher, my grandmother, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. In other words, he said, well, listen, if there's 5 nonconformities in Bob's report, and there's only 1 in my shop, in my factory, well, I'm not going to be happy with that. But he said, if there's 5 nonconformities in Bob's report, but there are 10 nonconformities out on the shop floor, I'm really not happy with that. Because I've got 5 things that could get me, and I don't know what they are. So scorekeeping, which is what the environmental manager was thinking about, is not uncommon. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But having this type of evolved, maybe aspirative approach to it, which this plant manager had, is not a bad approach, because at the end of the day, don't we want our audits to determine all of the things that can both benefit but can also hurt, or harm or affect the quality, affect the performance, affect, in the case of my environmental audit, the compliance status of the organization that we're auditing. One of the interesting things then about the concept of findings or nonconformities is that if they were a KPI, a key performance indicator, the ideal value would be diametrically opposed depending on who you're talking to, the auditor or the auditee. A little bit like one party sees the glass half full and the other party sees the glass half empty. From the standpoint of the auditor, well, what they're looking at audit findings and nonconformities, they're looking at it, or they should be looking at it, from the standpoint that stakeholders care, that in reality, all the nonconformities that exist in an organization's management system or in the state of their compliance for doing that kind of audit, all of those are important to shine light on. And as we should understand, because the definition of finding, which is the goal of any part of our audit, is conformity and nonconformity, they'll be good, they'll be bad. But one of the challenges also with this KPI or expectation is that auditors sometimes think, and maybe even in certification bodies are judged on, how many nonconformities they produce per report. In other words, the idea that more will prove my worth. And that is, if the auditor buys into the misconception, I'll say per the definition in 1911, that findings are simply the negatives. How can we have an audit with no findings? How can we have an audit with no negatives? I'm saying it's the other way. Findings are the good, the bad, and everything in between. And therefore, whatever the number is, whatever's out there is what should be reported on. Now, from the standpoint, though, of the auditee, they have maybe a different set of stakeholders, or maybe a single stakeholder, which is their boss. The boss cares. And so clearly, they look at findings, nonconformities in an audit as all bad. I don't know how many of you have ever given a audit report to an executive, and what do? You've written everything you can on the pages, and they flip to the end looking for the findings table. Uh, that's again just part of what people understand audits to be, from the adversarial, exceptions-based nature of government audits, IRS, OSHA, and that type of thing. And of course, what the auditee may also be thinking is, less findings prove my worth. Again, if the findings are assumed to be negative, any and all, then I don't want to have problems. I want to show that I'm managing my system well. Really, my tip for us as auditors is to not think that more proves, but that in fact, either type of finding proves our worth. Uh, Whether it's a conformity or a non-conformity, each have value. And I think where that comes in is when we often think about what companies do after they receive the audit report. Well, we know for nonconformities, those nonconformities need to be corrected. They need to be investigated for root cause, and likely they're going to be entered into some administrative system or database. There's an awful lot that has to happen per the standard with nonconformities. But what I also try to tell my clients is that, but you should be doing something with the good findings as well. Well, what do you mean, the conformities? Well, first of all, feel good about it, pat yourself on the back, but maybe there's something in there that you can leverage. In our reports, we would put the good findings in our executive report, and I would always ask my clients to look for any magic that those good findings might offer you as an organization. Things you could emulate and maybe utilize in other processes that aren't quite up to snuff. So another story. I'm on an audit with my good buddy Steve. We're getting near the end of the audit. We're trying to determine the findings as conformant or non-conformant, and I was really agonizing over one. I wasn't sure. There were compliance things involved, but this was a safety management system audit. Were they adhering to the requirements of the standard in general? How to portray it? What's the regulatory citation? And Steve, who was, a very smart guy and kept it simple, simply said about the one finding we were debating, hey, you know what? It is what it is. In other words, it is what it is. All right. Now you might think, well, that's a little overly simplistic an adage, like this won't hurt, or I'm here to help, or it's nothing really. But as I began to think about it, I realized that there is some genius and as well some benefit for us as auditors in that statement. It, it is what it is. There's no need for us to overthink it. And it kind of brought me to tying two things together, findings or conformity and nonconformity. And when you're making a judgment, it's going to be what it's going to be. Is that auditor discretion, auditor discernment? Might really be the best thing that we can rely on. If the evidence doesn't show it's a nonconformity, then it's a conformity. There's only two ways for it to go. Broadly defined as it is, it could be either. And so if you're not thinking that negative findings are necessary to prove your worth, you may as well please yourself because you can't please everybody all the time. If it's not a nonconformity, it's a conformity. It is what it is. And maybe one of the ways to think about that is to go back to basics a little bit. Let's try to understand what we're doing when we're making that it is what it is determination. And perhaps that'll give us some illumination. That'll give us some ideas. This figure, and I use the scale of justice to illustrate it, I show in most all of my audit courses. A simple construction that lets me convey, and to be honest, what I keep in the back of my mind when I'm doing audits. Because boiled down to its essence, this is what we're doing. And we often think of the auditor as the judge, the jury, and my clients might say, and the executioner. But we're really not. To be honest, I think we're less judge and more accountants because at its core, what we're doing as management auditors or even compliance auditors is we're comparing things. We are professional, if we work for a certification body, comparers. And going back to the definition of audit in ISO 1911, we are comparing, as we need to balance out the scales or show they're unbalanced, two things. One, audit evidence, the proof. And on the other side, audit criteria. That's the comparison. The judgment is fulfillment, which we've already described as being very broad. To what degree, to who. But it's those two things, audit evidence and audit criteria, that we're balancing out. And there are variations on, or combinations, if you will, that go into the criteria or the evidence. But the way that I've always thought about it, and it really clarifies it for me, is that the criteria fall into any one or combination of three categories. They could be a regulatory statute. I've done environmental and safety audits the bulk of my career, but even in quality management systems or even in energy management systems, there can still be regulatory or compliance requirements, and we know that needs to be part of the scope of the system. Procedures, the company's own procedures, and these can also be visual aids, signage, well, 1-minute lessons, standard work, anything that a company uses to convey their process, their procedure, their instruction. And of course, standards. The ISO standards, if we're doing a conformance audit, standards of practice in safety in OSHA, they're electrical and building standards that people often call the unwritten regulation because they're cited in OSHA regulations and therefore almost have the same weight. That's on one side of the scale. On the other side of the scale is the evidence, documents, records. If it ain't documented, it ain't being done, the adage we often follow. And so I put it up on the top, the best type of evidence, because it doesn't rely on memory or other circumstances. It memorializes the action. But there can also be statements. Interviews are the way we get statements. The statements that people make corroborated, ideally, or observation. And in environmental health and safety audits, there are often plenty of observations to make that comprise objective evidence. A good way of remembering it, you can read it, you can hear it, or you can see it. Those are the three ways we get evidence. That's the comparison. And so it is what it is, simply means that if the scales line up, then there's conformity. But if there's a reason for the scales not to line up, the criteria and the evidence are not in alignment, that's nonconformity. And as a quick aside, remember that nonconformity can be a case where what people are doing may generally be correct, but the procedure says otherwise. They're not following the written procedure. They've chosen to do something else that they think is better that may actually be better. But in a management system where documentation, where writing things down and following them to the letter is so critically important as an operational control, if the criteria doesn't balance with the evidence, that's still nonconformity. And the finding, of course, what comes out of this comparison, this balance, just two things, either conformity or nonconformity. We're meeting the requirements, we're fulfilling the requirements as stated, or we're not. Last story. I was conducting an audit. This was a safety audit as well, New York City. 19th floor of a building, a company that did light manufacturing, some assembly, some soldering. We were looking at exit egress points and emergency procedures, which were, this company had them controlled, dated, rev numbers on them. And we're in the soldering area, and I saw the emergency exit. I saw the sign, and with the safety manager, I said, well, let's go out and check it out. So we walked through the door, and there's a long hallway. We walked down to the end of the hallway, and in the hallway there were some chairs, and there were some things had been put there, which wouldn't have made it a very clear pathway to get out. So we're making a note about that. We get to the end of the hallway. This is the exit way. Push on the door, and it's locked from the outside. This was probably one of the easiest findings that I ever had to make because the safety manager looked at me and said, major nonconformity. And I only needed to nod my head and agree. This was a serious situation. Now, it was only once. All the other exit ports, emergency plans and exit ways we looked at seemed fine. And that may make you wonder, well, why did she say major nonconformity and why did I agree? So that takes me to the myths and lore about auditing that we want to understand and get past in order to be able to ultimately make the right call. And I think with the story that I just told, the idea of, well, you only saw it once, so why is it a major nonconformity? That gets into what I clearly consider to be the lore, which is that findings must be systemic in order to be nonconformities. But people interpret systemic, and I've often heard people call it systematic. In other words, it must be repeated. It must be something you see often in order for it to be a major nonconformity. No, systemic does not mean repeated or pervasive. It's really defined as of the system. If the system or something about the system is related to the evidence, it's systemic, it's a nonconformity, and in this case, it was a major nonconformity, even though it was only in one sample, one finding. I might add as a part of this, this was a number of years ago. There had been one of those fires in the Mideast where where clothing is manufactured that had trapped people. New York City, of course, was the site of the infamous shirtwaist factory fire in the early 1900s that ultimately led to a number of worker and occupational safety rules and regulations. But the idea of it being, if I see it once, it's a minor. If I see it three times, it's a major nonconformity. No, that's lore. That's a myth. Uh, if it's a part of the system and a serious issue, as my training as a safety professional taught me, major nonconformity was an appropriate grade to give it, even though it was only in one instance. And of course, the parts of the system that were at issue here included many. Uh, Emergency preparedness, of course. Why did anybody not know that this was an emergency exit to make sure it was kept clear and open? Communication with the landlord. This was a leased facility. How could the landlord lock an egress point and not know it was an egress point? And monitoring. How did the people in that area not periodically check on the status of that egress point? So there were a number of parts of the system that were at question, and I think the reason why the finding was appropriate. Another myth, if you will. You'll often hear auditors talk about, or auditees say, I'm going to make this nonconformity. I have to raise a nonconformity. And what that does is it makes the finding something that we create. Auditors don't make nonconformities. They're there before we arrive. We find them. We ferret them out. Okay, we shine the light on them. And so I try to avoid talking about making or raising a nonconformity. I mean, yes, we do trigger the administrative mechanism and clause of the standard that requires the investigation and so on, but we don't make it. We're simply there to ferret it out. One of the most common questions that I get during the training classes is, now, is this a major? Is this a minor? Is this an opportunity for improvement? You only saw it once. Maybe it should have been an OFI. These definitions were created for third-party audits, certification audits, the worry that if a company had a nonconformity of any type, of any degree, that would prevent certification. And it's really related to a very high bar, which is the confidence that stakeholders will have in the certification if there are nonconformities at a level, at a point, major enough where they shouldn't trust that warranty, that statement made by the certification body. They don't therefore apply uniformly to second and first party auditors. And so if, and as allowed in 1911, your organization is going to use major, minor, or OFI, a third party certification auditor can help you. Our definitions are for a different audience, a different purpose. Feel free to develop your own definitions because they're not mandatory to be used, although they're allowed, and they'll really be specific to your situation. And finally, the worry that nonconformities sometimes involve fault, failures. We've had 3 problems. We've got 2 issues. In this presentation, I've been trying to avoid using those words for nonconformities myself, and I probably haven't succeeded 100% of the time. You may be familiar with a pamphlet or booklet that's out there. The title of it is An Audit of the System, Not of the People. But that's a good thing to remember, particularly when we're looking at nonconformities, or even if we have to identify something as a major nonconformity. The system is usually what gives the people who work in an organization the wind beneath their wings. And that's where we need to look. If there's a fault or a failure, it's of the organizational system not being able to support the people and help them do what they need to do when they've got more things to think about than simply following the tenets of ISO. And so fault, failure, there is no fault and failure in nonconformities, generally speaking. And to me, I think that's a good way of thinking about it. So to wrap up, there'll always be findings, conformity or nonconformity. Maybe even in my first story, a dozen conformities before lunch. I thought I was doing a pretty good job, although I almost shocked the plant manager into fainting. Um, your worth is not defined by how many of either. And I know that's challenging. Sometimes organizations do expect that we'll find or improve, and we improve through finding issues or weaknesses or deficiencies or nonconformities, if we want to go to that word. So, but your worth, your value as an auditor should not be defined by those. It is what it is. Discretion is the better part of value. If we understand that our worth is not defined by the number of nonconformities we identify, then an audit with all conformant findings is still a good, well done audit. And again, we're more accountants than judges. We're simply gauging evidence, how we are we good, bad, are we mean or friendly? Eh, Convince the auditees that that's not a part of what we are. We're simply looking to see if it is what it is. We're auditing the system. We're not making judgments on people. And in terms of what our takeaways are as auditors from this, improvement. It's all about continual improvement. Continue improving your own knowledge, your own skill, and your own ability to convince auditees about what the process is and manage their expectations. At the end of the day, we want to make the right call. We want to have good judgment, but good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment. You might not always, in part, you might not always make the right call, but ideally you'll learn from it and be a better auditor or assessor going forward. Mike, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Bob. Good job there. Yes, thank you for doing that. And you can see Bob's contact information there if you'd like to contact him. And Bob, that was a great session on the need to identify nonconformities and some tactics to do that. That was really great. I think a lot of us got a lot of value out of that. So for those of you that are watching this on demand, as you can see right there, you can contact Bob directly if you do have questions, or you can write us at info@exemplarglobal.org. And you can we'll get your questions over to Bob that way. Another option is that Bob has agreed to join us at the live session that we're doing at the end of the expo. That's going to be on the 10th of April, Thursday, here in the States at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. I believe that corresponds to 8 a.m. In the morning down under in Sydney, Australia. So look out for that, and we'll send you information about how you can register for that event. And you can get CPD for that event as well as this event, this session, as well as all the sessions we have here at this year's expo. So Bob Clifford, thanks again for joining us and giving us that great presentation. Thanks to you all for being here, and enjoy the rest of the expo. Thanks again.